Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this ABA Tech Talk. 2020 has seen a renewed focus on cybersecurity, and I'm sure that you're all as interested in this very topical subject as I am, and indeed the whole team here at the ABA is. For those of you with questions, there will be an opportunity towards the end of today's session for you to use the Q&A function on the right-hand side of your screen to submit your questions. But now let me go straight to introducing our guest. We are absolutely thrilled that Alastair MacGibbon has agreed to join us for this session today. Some of you will be very familiar with Alastair's extensive background in this area. He has been working in cybersecurity across both government and the private sector. His previous roles have included the National Cybersecurity Advisor, Head of the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, and Special Advisor to the Prime Minister on Cybersecurity. Alastair has also served as the government's e-Safety Commissioner and as the General Manager of Security for Dimension Data. He helped establish the Australian Federal Police's High-Tech Crime Centre during his time with the AFP, and has also worked at eBay as its Director of Trust, Safety and Customer Support. Alastair is currently the Chief Strategy Officer at CyberCX, which has a workforce of over 500 of Australia's most talented cybersecurity professionals across 20 locations. Alastair, as I said at the outset, we are absolutely thrilled that you can join us. I know we have many bank employees, all of whom employed by members of the ABA, who are very keen to hear you. And I'm going to throw it over to you and Alastair to ask if you could perhaps begin or start the session off today with an overview of how you see the current threat landscape, some of the changes that you've seen over the years, and how you think COVID has changed things, if at all. Over to you, Alastair.
Sorry, it has to happen once during a presentation. Someone has their microphone muted, and your team may have noted I've managed to take myself offline during your introduction. So it's always good to get those technical hitches out of the way early. Thank you very much, Anna, for having me, and thank you to the ABA. I've had a long association with the ABA going back to my time in the Australian Federal Police when we established the Australian High-Tech Crime Centre in 2003, and it's been a privilege to work with the association throughout all of those years. Anna, if I was meeting with any senior bank leader today, whether they were on a board or they were in the C-suite of a bank, I would say that the cyber situation is worse today than it was yesterday, and tomorrow will be worse again still. And that's not because I'm a sky is falling guy. I'm actually reasonably positive, but it's because of three main drivers. The first is emboldened threat actors. The second is increasingly complex technical environments that we're trying to protect. And the third is the consequences of inevitable cyber failure and what impact that will have not just on individual institutions, but on society in the broad. So if I briefly cover off on those three drivers, it leads me to my less than happy assessment of our cyber environment. The first, in terms of emboldened threat actors. Threat actors come in various shapes and sizes, but I'll put them into two. One is nation states and the other is criminal groups. With nation states, the four key nations that are of interest in Australia are China, Russia, North Korea and Iran. And there is no doubt that those four nations have been active from time to time inside Australian networks, not just government networks. Now, nation-state threat actors by their nature are tasked by their political masters to gather information that relates to matters of strategic interest to those countries. And it may well be that that information resides inside the Australian banking system. Now, most nation states are not destructive. I'm going to get to the group that is shortly, being criminals. Having said that, 3 of those 4 nations have actually carried out destructive cyber activities over the last several years. So we've had North Korea responsible for the WannaCry global ransomware campaign of 2017. We've seen the Russians involved in various quite destructive activities, including the NotPetya global ransomware campaign also of 2017, attacks on energy systems inside the Ukraine, etc. And we've seen the Iranians carry out destructive attacks against US banks and, for example, turning off safety features in oil and gas plants in the Middle East with the intent to cause harm to the workers in those facilities. But generally, nations don't cause harm. They will try to take information that's relevant to them. The people that, as I said, are destructive are criminals. I spent my whole life dealing with criminals. I'm sure many people on this call have as well if they sit in security areas. Criminals build harm into their business model. That's how, in fact, they monetize. We are seeing a shift. Anyone that knows cybersecurity knows that it's actually about the concept of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information and systems. What we've seen in the last couple of years is a move away from just affecting our confidentiality, something we haven't done a great job of actually being successful in preventing. I'd probably give us a C- or a D as a nation or as a group of enterprises in protecting confidentiality. But it's the integrity and availability of that data and those systems that worries me most. And we see with crimes like ransomware or highly targeted distributed denial of service attacks, which we know have been directed against financial institutions, that calls into question this concept of integrity and availability of data and systems. And that's what should worry us as a society. And it's certainly worrying the federal government increasingly, which we'll get to briefly. Suffice to say that threat actors are emboldened, and with that emboldened threat actor comes increased risk for us. The next issue I spoke about, and by the way, they're emboldened, Anna, because we've not driven cost into their operations. We've not given them consequences for their actions. And we all know that unless you put consequences on actions, then people will go up to the extent that they can. The next issue was this complex technology environment, and there are a few factors in that. The first is as soon as we plug a server into our networks, as soon as we plug a laptop in, we know, of course, that that's almost out of date, and we know that it's harder to protect systems that are out of date. And we have an increasingly large tech debt in our economy and in our society more broadly. And that will cause ongoing problems for us. The other aspect of things like this, my mobile phone, which updated just last night, a completely flashed operating system, where I have to now have confidence in the manufacturer of that device to know that it actually does what is written on the side of the box. This concept of assurance has gone. We used to care about what every line of code does and what every piece of technology does. And now it moves too fast for us to have that assurance. And the third aspect is what I'd say is this nexus between the IT environment and OT environment, the operational technology environment that is essentially the industrial layer of our society and economy. And anyone that's worked in cybersecurity knows that we have a very poor handle on the actual functioning and security of our operational technology that underpins our very society. And increasingly, we'll see threat actors move into that IT, OT space. The last of the key drivers for my dark assessment of where we stand is this concept of consequences when risk is realised, Anna. And that is quite logical, of course, as we rely more and more upon connected technologies. We will see increased harm associated with the failure of those technologies. Now, we call this cybersecurity, but really it's a very poor phrase for it because the concept of security implies that it's binary. You're either secure or you're insecure. And really this is a risk management exercise. And APRA has recognised that with its CPS 234, as has the broader government. And so really, since it's a risk management exercise, we know that from time to time risk will be realised. My concern, of course, is that the impact upon us when that risk is realised is only increasing with our connected technologies. That brings me to whether or not things have changed with COVID. Most certainly. We, being white-collar workers, are extremely privileged. I fear for those that remained, or feared at least. We seem to have done a good job here in Australia for those who had to remain on the front line, or those who weren't privileged enough to be able to work from home. But white-collar professionals rapidly changed the way they worked, and now we see that concept of this complex tech environment that we rely upon being even more complex, because home routers and other bits of technology that weren't normally inside our security purview provide a platform for attack by an offender. We've also seen, of course, scammers increase their level of activities during COVID, as they do with any crisis, but we've certainly seen quite a significant uptick in criminality online during the COVID pandemic. And we've interestingly seen the government responding. So the 2020 cybersecurity strategy and related critical infrastructure paper, and now draft legislation, really goes to the heart of driving greater obligations upon systems owners and operators, of which, of course, as you would know, the banking industry forms one of the very key planks within. So I think we'll see governments responding increasingly to that threat environment that I've just mentioned, Anna. So I hope that that's sufficient in terms of opening remarks for you, and will leave myself open to you to direct the conversation. It's your turn to be muted now.
Well, you're both being very high tech here, Alastair. I thank you very much for those very relevant and I think stimulating opening remarks. Can I just remind everybody who's online that your questions and comments are welcome. If you could now put them into the Q&A part, we will publish them, and everyone will be able to see your questions, and we'll direct them to you, Alastair, and make sure that we will try to give you as much time as possible to respond to them. Alastair, I might just kick off. I was interested in your observation that one of the reasons that we're seeing more emboldened threat actors is because there are few, if any, real consequences. And I wonder what your thinking is about what kind of consequences do you think could actually diminish the levels of emboldenment, if you like?
Yeah, well, look, Anna, this is something that I'm particularly upset at myself for if it's time for self-reflection. As mentioned in the introduction, and as I said in my opening remarks, I've had a long association with the Banking Association, and that goes back to my days in the Federal Police and when we set up the Australian High-Tech Crime Centre. I'll be a bit controversial here, perhaps, and say that I think law enforcement in this country, and frankly every other country, gave up on the concept of actually enforcing laws online many years ago. And what that means is that if a criminal is not inside the jurisdiction of Australia, the likelihood of Australia pursuing that criminal offshore is extremely remote. Criminals know that, of course, and with the internet, it's most logical that most often the offenders are not actually inside the Australian jurisdiction. They do rely upon poor enforcement in other countries, and the international cooperation mechanism for law enforcement was set up well before the need for internet speed in terms of how we respond. So one, law enforcement needs to do better. Two, we need to collect complaints better than we currently do, because if you don't know an offence has occurred, then of course that lets law enforcement off the hook. When it comes to nation states, you have seen Western countries, including Australia, increasingly naming nations. So I personally stood up and named multiple countries from Russia to China and North Korea for activities over the years, if that is endorsed, of course, by Cabinet to do so. It's not always in Australia's interests to name who the offender is, nor is there usually a significant amount of impact upon those countries when they're named. In fact, I'll go so far as to say that when Russia gets named for things like interfering in the US elections, I'm pretty sure that Vladimir Putin takes it as a badge of honour that people see the Russians able to project their power that way. So nations need to get smarter and better at driving cost. That might be sanctions, or it might be other regimes that help create this concept of online norms. The United Nations and others have made some attempt towards that, but it would be fair to say that it's nascent and it's unlikely it's ever going to be highly impactful. What I should say is that I'm not an advocate of using cyber to fight cyber. My former colleague in the UK, who's now also formerly head of the equivalent entity that I ran in Australia, has also said that just because you're attacked using cyber means doesn't mean you have to be using a cyber weapon back. You could be using a sanction. You could arrest people who are connected to it. You could deny them visas or other such things to travel. So there are different ways that you can actually push costs back in. And I certainly believe that has to be done because, Anna, the only people we've driven cost into in terms of fighting cybercrime or cybersecurity issues more broadly is actually ourselves. So it's a huge cost to companies, it's a huge cost to governments, and often that's reflected in usability and convenience, which also drives cost into our operations. So it's a long answer to a question, but it's certainly something that we need to have as a key agenda in state and Commonwealth governments.
Thank you. It's very complex. I appreciate that, but I agree with you totally. Unless there's a cost to some of these actors, it's not easy to see how we're going to see it diminish anytime soon. I was particularly interested, Alastair, in your point about the nexus between the IT environment and the OT environment. And the minute it goes out of a pristine IT environment into an operating reality with human beings and all kinds of other influences, that nexus I can see becomes increasingly important. And I just wondered, in relation to the point you made about COVID, I don't think we really know what the future of working from home is, and what working in a white collar environment and going to the office might look like in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years' time. But I think we can reasonably predict that there is going to be more flexibility between, about where people are physically doing the work they're doing, whether it's in a coffee shop, at home, in a park, or in a head office, or in maybe a local work hub of some description. And I'd be interested in your observations about how you think that more distributed, if you like, OT environment, what that brings to the equation.
Yes, it's a great question, Anna. In fact, this whole conversation we're having is an example. Of course, it was in my diary to meet with you today. And my staff just thought it was a good idea that I do that remotely and then have meetings built around it in Canberra. This wouldn't have happened this way, as much as 6 months ago or at least a year ago. We would be having a face-to-face conversation, and everything has shifted. And it's likely, of course, that will continue for quite some time, if not forever, and that we've shifted the way of working. There are some really significant questions we need to ask, where there's this link between physicality and the electronic environment. So we know that physical security is connected to our cybersecurity. If I was to take this laptop out of the work environment and move it into a home environment, or to a co-working space or a cafe, it can be more readily compromised than if it was sitting inside a more secure office environment. And the same goes for what's on my computer screen, and who can read it, the printers and other things that I connect to, and how they can actually relate to the integrity of that device. And so All of those things are going to need to be built into the way we secure or try to better secure our work environments. And, again, in terms of criticality, there are a few areas more critical than our finance sector to keep our economy running. But we have seen a shift over several years towards this anyway, with things like BYOD and while many of the larger banks will have resisted connecting personal devices onto their corporate networks, I'm sure many smaller institutions have. We've increasingly allowed the blurring. I can get a personal email and a work email on this same device, and on it goes. So we've certainly blended our personal and our work lives to such an extent that actually increases the threat surface for us. And I think COVID just accelerated some of those trends we were seeing. And again, the last point I'd make is, and I'm no expert on these things, it would appear that will stick for quite some time, which then changes how we have to have our security posture.
Indeed. Alastair, would you regard Australia as a particularly appealing target to, global threat actors? Where do you think we stand as a target or a market in that global context?
So I think we have, if I start with criminals, there's no doubt criminals have been in the past quite agnostic as to into who they target. So if they were to craft an English-speaking scam or phishing attack, they would apply that against the United States, the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Being Anglophile, of course, it meant that generally a scam would work across most of those economies. So we've had both the privilege and the cost associated with that, with what I'd be saying are these omnidirectional assaults from criminals. I would say, of course, that there is a link between nation-state activities and the broader geopolitical environment. So when tensions are higher with certain nations, we would expect to see those nations' intelligence agencies, usually manifested these days in cyber form, being more active in what they'd see as a competitor network. So yes, we shouldn't underrate how good a target we are. Criminals tend to be agnostic as to where they can get their cash from. If they can get it from Australia, they'll get it from Australia.
I've got a question here, Alastair. Someone saying, I've heard you say before that increasingly the threat of hackers altering information is as big a threat as them stealing it. Are you seeing more of a trend in that altering versus stealing space?
Yes. So as I mentioned, cybersecurity is about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. For a long time, we focused on confidentiality, the concept of not having our customer records stolen or our employee records stolen or our partners' records stolen or our IP stolen. And as I said, I think we've done sadly quite a poor job as a community holistically in protecting that personal information or that corporate information or that IP. Now that's bad enough. Now I've done that walk of shame many times, Anna, trying to explain how it was possible for a corporate or a government entity to lose information, to have a foreign entity or a criminal group inside their networks. That's one thing. But the thing that should keep us awake at night, all of us, and especially those who maintain our financial records, is what happens if you can no longer rely upon the integrity of those records or the availability. But worse than lack of availability, because at least you can't access, is what if I just can't trust? Now, as we move into a world of real-time decision-making, a 5G world where 5G isn't just about me being able to watch videos faster on my mobile devices. 5G is primarily about how industrial machinery will make decisions quickly and do things in a more automated sense. And the trouble with that is that means that we cut humans increasingly out of the loop. If they can't rely upon the integrity of the telemetry upon which they make those decisions, if we can't rely upon the integrity of our land title records, our financial records, where a plane is in the sky, that really becomes problematic. In fact, I've publicly said many times that it's actually existential to our community and to our existence if we can no longer rely upon the integrity. And yes, we've seen a shift of criminals, definitely to the attacking the availability of information and systems. I think every time we have someone inside our networks doing something bad, we now need to start asking ourselves, did they potentially alter those records? And what would we do if they did?
Alastair, this year the government released its updated cybersecurity strategy. What are your thoughts about that strategy document?
So I, Anna, was involved in delivering, not creating, but delivering upon the expectations of the 2016 strategy that was launched by Malcolm Turnbull in April 2016. That strategy was as much about opportunity as threat. It was about growing a cybersecurity environment and capability in Australia so we could compete with the world, so we could build the DNA of Australia to protect itself. The 2020 strategy builds upon the 2016 strategy. It's certainly better funded. There's a lot more money in it. Most of that money, of course, gets recycled inside government into the intelligence agencies, 500 extra staff over a decade for the Australian Signals Directorate, 100 extra staff for the Australian Federal Police to have cyber investigators. All good things, I'd say. I think the most important thing in the strategy, Anna, is it needs to be read in conjunction with the critical infrastructure discussion paper, which was released, I think it was a week or a week and a half or so after the strategy was launched. And that broadens the categories of critical infrastructure. Banking and finance has always been considered one of the critical infrastructure sectors, albeit it wasn't regulated under the Securing of Critical Infrastructure Act, which it now will be, or at least is likely to be if the amendments to the SOCI Act pass. And that's really where you see this increasing muscularity in government and an increasing expectation and obligations upon boards and the C-suite to understand risk. Now, I would posit that the finance sector is amongst the best placed of those critical infrastructure sectors to accommodate these new obligations. And that's because of APRA's CPS 234, which you've now been implementing as a sector for over a year. And it means that, again, it talks about understanding the risk environment, satisfying yourself that your responses as an organisation to that risk environment match the risk, etc. So it is this concept of risk, and it's understanding not just getting briefings, but understanding and satisfying yourself that you can respond to those risks. And that might seem burdensome to the industry. If there's any good news for you, and I know that APRA announced just yesterday that they want to up those obligations and are minded to now look at auditing them, and then probably I would suggest enhancing those obligations and certainly broadening them out to the supply chain. And I know that might seem burdensome. If it's any comfort, there are many other sectors that are now going to be pushed into a very similar state of play. As a citizen, that's a good thing because it increases our resilience. It will lower the cost associated with that type of compliance because it will become more part of a standard way of operating. And certainly, I think is a just-in-time, maybe a little bit late response to this increased threat environment that I mentioned in my opening remarks.
Thanks, Alastair. I've got a couple of questions in different ways about the critical infrastructure paper and the government's thinking on this. And I think probably from this sector's point of view, and it goes very much to the point you were just talking about, this is a very highly regulated industry, and the requirements and obligations of banks in the cybersecurity area are already regulated and seriously regulated by APRA. So I think probably the question across the industry, and there's a number of questions here that go to this, is how does that critical infrastructure bill and the proposals within it, what is the best way for that to interact with the existing regulatory framework? I think when there are, any serious attacks on any part of the banking system, that might lead to, issues of national security. APRA knows this industry and the players in it and how it operates and how it all links up than any outside agency. And I think banks are very keen to make sure that that expertise that's been developed within APRA over a very long period of time, as well as being connected to all of the right people in every institution, that's not somehow lost, because we think that might in fact decrease security to lose that primary focus.
I think you raise a really important point. In my discussions with the Department of Home Affairs, their view of the regulatory setting. So if we think of the SOCI, the SOCI amendment as the vehicle from which the various regulatory regimes will stem, APRA would set, and maybe others, maybe it's the Reserve Bank or others as well, would set these obligations for the sector. If we were in the transport sector, which is a much messier sector in terms of where the regulators sit, often they're state and territory regulators, as you would know from your past. If we're talking about land transport, air transport, different again. The view of the Commonwealth is that the regulators, the ones who are closest to the industry, and I know from time to time industry doesn't always think its regulators are too close to it at all, but certainly they're more likely to understand, they're more likely to have the connections with the industry in order to set those obligations. And theoretically, the aim is to set them in consultation with the industry. So we should see each sector that's regulated, hopefully with commonality across them, so that let's call it the electricity sector, which is again extraordinarily vital to the very functioning of our society. You would hope to see commonality with how banking and finance is meant to operate, but you would expect it to be nuanced to an electricity grid and electricity generators in a way that would be fundamentally different to, say, a retail bank. So the aim is that you would have these core components that regulators would work with the industry to set the expectation. One thing I would say, Anna, and I think it's a really important conundrum inside the cybersecurity industry, is the fundamental difference between a compliance-based regime and a risk-based resilience type regime, and the two can function together, but often they're mistaken. So particularly if I put my old government hat on, I would constantly come across senior leaders inside the bureaucracy who would say, we are secure because we follow the architectural obligations and these compliance obligations of government. And I would say, no, that gives you a baseline of predictability. It designs out certain things. It does not make you secure. Security comes with understanding risk, testing that, and et cetera, et cetera. And banks know risk, of course. I mean, the finance sector is amongst the best of any of the sectors to understand risk and the concept of resilience. So theoretically, Anna, APRA would still maintain the driver's seat in terms of that regulatory environment. I can understand the fear, and we, as a company at CyberCX, we've echoed our concerns to the federal government that while we're very supportive of seeing the entity that I used to be in having the ability to step in and help defend networks, you can only defend what you know. And it's very unlikely that an intelligence officer or a police officer will understand the complexities of a large retail bank or an institutional bank. And you probably don't want their fingers behind those keyboards. You want them to work collaboratively with bank security folk or the regulator who actually understand the system. So I think your concerns are justified. I think we'll see the government step back a little bit in this consultative phase, but if I even look at the press in the last 24 hours, it's clearly not stepping back far from from what its sort of stated objectives is in this space.
Thank you, and thank you for any assistance you've provided, backing up some of the concerns of the industry. I mean, obviously, very keen to work with the government, very keen to get it right, but for the very reasons you've outlined, wanting to make sure that the risk and resilience schemes and the capability that's being systematically developed through at both the regulator level and within the industry itself can be brought to bear should we, heaven forbid, ever face a circumstance like that. One of the questions I have here, Alastair, is, you do a lot of work with banks and with the whole sector. Obviously, any part of a bank at any time is vulnerable to attack, but do you see any areas as being particularly vulnerable? Are there areas that you've seen, particularly criminal gangs, see as sort of ripe targets, or where would you see the kind of priority areas for attention?
Yeah, so I might answer in typical MacGibbon fashion. I do apologise. If ever you want me to shut up, I'm sure the producers on your side can just mute me, Anna, if you want to keep me to shorter answers. I'm going to start by saying the number one target every time by a criminal or a nation state is us, the end user. The weakest link in any system is not, and Malcolm Turnbull used to refer to it as the wet layer or the human layer. It's layer 8 in terms of the technology stack, is us as end users. So if we think of phishing, which started in the early 2000s, the reason why it can still be successful today and in the broad, hopefully designed out increasingly by sophisticated banks, is because it targets the end user. It actually circumvents the technological controls and goes to the end user. So usually a criminal or a nation state is going to want a user to click on a link, give a password, or do something that we don't want them to do. So the weakest link is humans. That's in the broad. I would say that in terms of the banking institutions, I would never purport to completely understand the architecture of a big retail bank, for example. But what I would say is I think it's the supply chain. So if I go to a non-banking example, if we look at Target and the massive data breach that occurred in Target some years ago, that malicious code was introduced to the Target network and eventually found its way into the point of sale devices of Target all around the United States, was introduced by a third-party contractor who had a connection to, an automated connection to the Target back-end systems. And the government in its 2020 strategy and in this critical infrastructure a series of measures is increasingly talking about supply chains. So we know that that all institutions, particularly your largest members, will have very long and complex supply chains. I think that the way we've enforced or tried to bring security into those supply chains has to change. So banks led the charge, and to the credit, I think, of your members, they certainly started doing that by enforcing it through legal means, contractual means, and that was a good start. I would sign, if I was a supplier to a bank, that I adhered to their security principles and the obligations. They then went into self-assessment mode for more critical supply chain folk. They would then get into the actual audit side. I think we need to step up even further and move into an environment of either supplying security down through that supply chain. And I think of the defence sector as a classic example of that as well, where we have thousands of very small providers who might be actually doing a very critical thing in building a sub, for example. And how do you secure that supply chain? It's the same with a bank. So I think we'll move more and more to this concept of white label security provided by the largest institutions out to their supply chain to actually then be able to give themselves greater assurance that security is indeed in place.
Thank you. Probably kind of related to that, there are, as you would be very well aware, a raft of new players increasingly coming on, populating the finance sector landscape. fintechs, buy now, pay later schemes. Many of these are offering, products and services and a way of doing business that customers, want. And I think we can expect we're going to see more new players on this, on the playing field. How would you see the security risks? And those players will be connected to more traditional players because they'll all be using, they'll all be using, for example, the new payments platform. And how do you see the security risks in those newer players? Are they the same, similar, entirely different? And to what extent do you think they're on top of those risks?
Yeah, look, it's a really fascinating question, Anna, because while I'm a huge supporter, of course, of good consumer experiences and new consumer experiences leveraging technology and other such things, we need to be extremely careful that we're not trading off security in that process. And just because you're cool doesn't make you secure. And I think a lot of the startup community has been looking for almost, and not such startup community, certainly the disruptors have been looking almost for a license not to be to have those same onerous security requirements that your larger institutions will have. And I've said for many years, and I'll continue to say it, that I don't think they should be allowed to participate in a marketplace unless they have a similar level of assurance about how my data as a consumer or the security of the overall system that maintains its integrity, so that they don't become a potential weak point for the sector as a whole. And that means that there need to be either systems introduced by government to help raise the standard of those competitors to the more to the larger institutions, or just push obligations upon them that they must. I certainly have a significant problem with any regime that would allow them to be sort of exempt from those security requirements. I hope what I'm saying is clear. In other words, while I actually like competition, I know your members do as well, that should not come at the cost of the privacy and security of the very customer set, or more importantly, the integrity of the overall banking system, because that would defeat the purpose of that whole push by government to open up the market to innovation and competition.
Alastair, I just want to take you back to that human layer and your observations about that. I don't have any data on this, but I was talking to a senior banker this morning who talked about, I think all banks have got data that shows that certainly scams have increased significantly during COVID for many of the reasons that you've outlined. But this was the first time I'd heard someone say that they'd seen a big increase in their bank this year on romance scams. And, I think we know that some of these criminal gangs are very, very clever at exploiting, human emotion, loneliness, and perhaps that was even more obvious during a time when people were isolated and locked down and away from others. And I wonder what you think about how we could more comprehensively protect customers from some of these things. Banks and other financial organisations actually have a lot of information, and they're often trying to tell individual customers that they think they're involved in a scam. And unfortunately, at that point where the person's wanting to transfer money, they're deeply emotionally involved, and it's pretty hard for a bank to turn them around sometimes. But before they ever get to that point, it's almost, I've been thinking, is there a role here for, something like a campaign that really gets into our minds, like slip, slop, slap, for example? What's the equivalent in recognising a scam?
Yeah, so thanks, Anna. Well, there's no doubt there's been an increase in scams during COVID, as we've said, and just to reinforce your point, scammers play on whatever our hot buttons are. My desire for company, a sense of urgency, a sense of fear, a sense of obligation, etc., etc. So they just play on the classic human emotions, the beautiful things that make us humans, and it's particularly horrendous. And I've spent the last 20 years or so dealing with victims of online crime, and no one can tell the victim of an online crime that they're any less victimised than their offline counterparts. The harm is extraordinary, and I've met many people who've fallen victim to online scams. I've often thought, Anna, I'm surprisingly much more attractive online, it seems, to people than I am when I'm in public places. I know it's a shock to think, particularly with my Movember moustache on, that I'm not attractive to people necessarily face to face, but online I can receive a lot more overtures than what I would normally expect. And sadly, that is scammers, right? So there's certainly an uptick. You asked, what can we do about it? This goes to a really fundamental question of pushing cost in. I know that, for example, NAB and Telstra and others are involved in cleaner pipes, and this concept of how we can kill scams before they get to the inboxes or the phones of potential victims. And I would implore your members to become more involved in the Cleaner Pipes initiative, because that's the concept of real-time stopping threats getting to a customer, whether it's a customer of their own bank or some other bank, their own ISP or some other ISP. The point is the entire system is harmed by scams. So I really credit the banking industry and the telecommunications industry for starting to step up there. For many years, I've said that last mile is the key. It's really the telcos and the ISPs that can probably make the biggest impact in terms of protecting us as normal users, because they can usually tell when something is a scam. It's not like the postal service. It's not like the fact that you can't see what's inside the envelope. You can actually see that something is malicious code. You can tell when something is spoofed or faking its sender details when you're a telco or an ISP, and as a consequence, there's a lot more that can be done there. I think, and I mentioned in my open, when you talked about how can we asked how we can drive cost into offenders. We've done a very poor job in this country of actually collecting complaints. We tend to direct them to individual institutions, and that's good because an institution can fix our problem. But unless we aggregate that information and then share it real time with others, if we were quick and smart, Anna, you'd always going to have some. Sorry for my long answer. It's actually an area that matters very significantly to the broader community. There's always going to be some people victim of scams, but the key question is how many. So let's say 3 or 4 people fall victim to some pernicious romance scammer. They report that to either their bank or their telecommunications provider. If that was pooled and then sent out to others, and it was said, hey, we're not saying not to transfer funds to this particular account, but we are saying that you should consider it as a financial institution, raise risk flags, then I think we would add cost into the offenders and we would reduce harm. The last thing I'd say is this. You mentioned that banks might know that I'm a victim and they'll try to convince me out of sending money to a scammer. I've had friends who are detectives who actually have gone to people's houses to say, you are the victim of a scam, of an investment scam or some other scam. And they've actually accused those detectives of wanting to muscle in on the scam, of muscling in on the investment. And you're just trying to take some of my future earnings away, which is just a horrendous thought that people wouldn't believe a police officer who comes to their door to warn them. And it shows you how effective scammers are at convincing us that what they are doing is real. In the cold, hard light of day, most victims, feel really guilty and wonder how they ever fell victim to it. When you're in that mindset and when you're in that very narrow tunnel, scammers are very, very good at carrying out their activities, which is why, as I say, we should either be killing the threat before it gets to an inbox or a telephone, or stopping those funds transferring through the financial system. It's a long answer to a question. I apologise.
No, thank you. A lot of very helpful insights and observations. because of course, for many people who work in banks at the front line with customers, whether they're, on call centres or in branches, they see the heartache that it causes, and it is a very human. There's a very human side to all of this. There's the big national security issues that everybody needs to be mindful of, but there's a lot of human, suffering, and people's financial well-being is put at serious risk or seriously diminished as a result. Alastair, you did touch a little on this earlier, but I just thought we might go, we've had a question and we might just go a bit further into it. And that's the question of 5G. The questioner here observes that it's great from a technology perspective, but what do you think it will mean in terms of cybercrime?
I thought you were going to ask me about the Huawei decision there, Anna, but I was getting ready to...
You can speculate on that if you wish.
I was going to defend the Commonwealth on its decision, but I'll leave that. That's good. Look, the more connectivity is great, of course, and the more connected we are, the more phenomenal things that we can build as institutions. I'm sure banks will work out what to do with decreased 5G is all about decreasing the latency of the way data flows and increasing, I guess, therefore, how much you can do at a remote endpoint, if that makes sense. And I can start thinking of these phenomenal sort of consumer and industrial applications that will come from 5G. Now, the downside, of course, is for every upside with technology, there's always someone that's going to work out how to create a downside for us. Which is sad that those people don't use their God-given skills for more productive means. But I suspect, I guess there'll just be more ubiquity of not devices like this. So my mobile device, I'm probably not going to carry many more than one or two of those. But I'll have a lot more sort of Internet of Things type devices that will impact me. And as your members would know, they might only cost a couple of cents each. The integrity of those devices, the ability to patch them, their level of security will be very questionable, if any security at all. And so as we move into this 4G space, what we're going to see is the Internet of Things will explode. From billions of devices to many billions of devices, and my fear there goes to the integrity and availability question. As we rely more and more upon whatever information or activity that those devices will carry out for us or collect for us, we will see scammers or criminals either taking that information, altering that information, or impeding that information. And again, it goes to one of those core levers that I mentioned that makes our situation worse, which is both an increasing complexity of the environment and then therefore the consequences associated with the failure.
We might finish with this last question, which a question that came in a little while ago. For a long time, banks and financial institutions have concerned themselves with protecting confidential information, and by and large they do it very well. And it is one area I should note here that we obviously do research on what the community thinks about banks, and there's been some, it's been a pretty, barren landscape over the last 3 to 4 years. But the one area where the community has incredibly high levels of trust in banks is the ability of banks to keep their money secure and their personal information confidential. In fact, they trust banks more than government, more than the big tech companies, and the only institutions that they trust more than banks in this regard is their doctor and their hospital. So, there's a lot of work to do on trust in other areas of banking, but, I do think that's a credit to the industry and the investment that it's made over a very long time. But despite the fact that they do that very well, the questioner asks, in this rapidly changing world, what should they be most keenly focused on? There's many things you could be doing in this space. But if you were running one of, this area in one of our banks, what would you be getting your team to focus on as sort of the 3 or 4 primary things?
Fantastic. Well, great question. Can I just say that I'm glad people trust banks more than they do the big tech companies with their data, because that's a good thing. I'm surprised they trust doctors and hospitals with it, because when you look inside some of their IT systems, it's not always a pretty sight, and that's often because of the way in which work gets done. You've got surgeons who just refuse. They want access to data quite logically. If they're operating on me, I want them to have access, and they don't want impediment to it. So hospital systems and doctors' surgeries can be pretty shocking. So it's I thought it's good to see, and you're right, in what can be a pretty barren landscape for someone in your role or others that are on this call. It's good to see some positives, right? What would I do? I guess it's a great question. So I think we need to move away from this concept, and I'm embarrassed talking to people who know their business so well. I think security practitioners know that they need to move away from this concept of feeling like by buying technology they can secure themselves. And this is not a great revelation. We need to actually accept the fact that risk is going to be realised, and we need to move more into the space of how to detect when risk is being realised, and we need to be more exercised about how we quickly tamp down those events and that risk to reduce harm. So it's this classic NIST cycle, which is reduce risk where you can, which I think big banking institutions have been actually very good at, there's no doubt. Move more into that space of understanding the environment and knowing what's anomalous behaviour, and then I think moving more into that incident response space. Certainly that's what the government is going to be saying that organisations need to do, and I think your association, Anna, I think the Banking Association and your members are actually, as I said, amongst the best prepared. But I just say convince your boards and convince your CEO and others that you need to move away from this concept of an extremely hard exterior, which we now can prove doesn't exist, and instead be more risk focused, and therefore understand things are going to get are going to go bad and how quickly we can put them out. The analogy is bushfires. This time last year we were going through horrendous times. I live rurally. I had fires all around for months on end, and it was any person that lived through that knew how bad it was. But you live in a country like this, you can't stop fires. Your aim is to reduce the likelihood of them occurring, to shape them as best you can so they burn theoretically, at least in areas where less harm will come, and to get society back up and running again once those fires have passed through. And we need to take that same attitude with cyber security or cyber resilience, because if I go back to my opening statement, the situation's not getting any better, and that's not trying to promote my company nor the security teams within banks. It's to say that's just the reality, and we've got to learn to live with it, and we can't pretend it doesn't exist, and we can't think that we can design our way out of it. We've just got to live with it, just as we're starting to live in a COVID type environment.
Well, thank you for those concluding words, Alastair. I think when you're talking risk, you're talking our language. As you noted many times, it's a concept that is well understood and well managed in Australia's banks and financial institutions. And we don't want to have any risk that we're going to go over time, because I'm very committed to making sure that our people are able to participate in these events without missing out on anything, and that with us meeting our deadline. So I think with 1 minute to go, Alastair, on behalf of all of our member banks and everybody who's been able to join us online today, can I just say thank you very much for your time, for sharing quite openly some of your experience and some of your insights and observations. This landscape is going to be very interesting in the next few years with the critical infrastructure bill, as you said, 5G, potential changes to to what regulators will expect and what they'll be looking for when they're assessing whether banks are meeting those expectations. So there's a lot happening in this space, and we hope that collectively it will all contribute to a safer banking system, to a safer a set of arrangements for customers, and frankly to a safer nation. So thank you, Alastair. It's been a pleasure to spend time with you.
Thanks, Anna. Much appreciated to you and your members.
Thank you.